If you've ever noticed that you don't talk about your struggles as much as other people do, that you tend to just deal with things quietly, move on and keep going, you might not realize it, but that says more about you than you think. Because for some people, strength doesn't look loud. It looks like independence. It looks like emotional control. It looks like not needing anyone. And that pattern shows up very clearly in one generation in particular. Gen X is often described as independent, low maintenance, and self-reliant. They don't ask for much. They don't expect constant validation. They're comfortable being on their own, figuring things out without help. On the surface, it looks like confidence, like emotional stability, like they just don't need the same things others do. But when you look a little closer, there's something more underneath. Because people don't just become that independent for no reason. Many Gen X individuals grew up in environments where emotional support wasn't always consistent. Not necessarily absent, but not always available in the way it is today. Parents were often busy, working long hours, focused on providing rather than emotionally engaging. So kids learned something very early on. If you were upset, you figured it out. If something went wrong, you adjusted. If you needed attention, you didn't always get it. So over time, needing less became the safest option. This is why a lot of Gen X adults move through life with a quiet kind of self-sufficiency. They don't rely heavily on others because they never fully learned to. They don't open up easily, not because they don't feel deeply, but because expressing those feelings wasn't always met with understanding. So they process things internally, silently, sometimes even invisibly. You might notice this in small ways, like brushing things off with humor instead of talking about them, or avoiding emotional conversations altogether, or feeling uncomfortable when things get too vulnerable, too quickly. Not because they don't care, but because emotional exposure wasn't something they were taught to sit with. And then there's another layer. Gen X grew up during a time of major cultural and social shifts, rising divorce rates, economic uncertainty, less supervision, more time alone. They're often called the latchkey generation for a reason, coming home to empty houses, figuring things out on their own, learning independence not as a personality trait, but as a necessity. And here's where it starts to shape identity. Because when independence becomes your default, reliance starts to feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. You might find it easier to solve problems alone than to ask for help. Easier to stay quiet than to explain how you feel. Easier to detach than to depend. And here's where it gets interesting. Gen X isn't just independent, they're carefully independent. There's a difference. Because this isn't just about being capable, it's about not wanting to be let down. It's about not expecting too much, so you don't feel disappointed. It's about staying in control of your own needs, so you don't have to rely on anyone else to meet them. So what looks like strength on the outside is often a form of protection on the inside. This also explains why many Gen X individuals are highly adaptable. They can handle change. They don't panic easily. They've learned to adjust, to keep moving, to make things work. But that adaptability often comes from a place of having no other option. When things were uncertain, you adapted. When support wasn't there, you became your own support. You'll also see this in how they approach relationships. They tend to value space. They don't always need constant communication. They're not always expressive in obvious ways. But that doesn't mean the connection isn't there. It just means it shows up differently, more subtle, more steady, less verbal, more consistent. At the same time, vulnerability can feel complicated. Opening up might feel unnatural or even unnecessary or risky. Because if you've spent years relying on yourself, letting someone else in can feel like losing control. And over time, this creates a quiet internal pattern. You handle things alone. You don't make a big deal out of struggles. You move forward even when things are heavy. And eventually, it becomes part of how you see yourself. I'm just someone who deals with things. I don't need much. I'm fine. But sometimes that identity can make it harder to recognize your own needs. Not because they're not there, but because you've learned not to prioritize them. And that's the part that often gets misunderstood. Gen X isn't emotionally distant. They're emotionally self-contained. They feel deeply. They observe quietly. They process internally. They just don't always express it in ways that are visible. That's not a lack of emotion. It's a different relationship with it. So when you see that quiet independence, that ability to handle things without asking for help, that tendency to stay steady even when things are difficult, it's easy to label it as strength. And in many ways, it is. But it's also a pattern, one shaped by environment, by experience, by what was available and what was not. Because for Gen X, independence wasn't just a trait, it was something they learned to rely on. And once you see that, you start to understand the behavior a little differently. It was never random, it was formed. And awareness like that has a way of changing how you see people and yourself. If this explains something you've noticed, there's always more beneath the surface.